Saves the batteries. I was saying that, my God. I was saying that some of us are slower than others. I was very uncomfortable when I left here yesterday because I had not given any kind of answer to Todd Pensler's question, which I'm hoping you're not going to remember, but Derek, Todd Endelman, Derek Pensler. So I've offended him now twice.
Compared me to Todd, I couldn't be more honest.
What I would have said had I been on the ball was that I live and work among people that I think are covered by this thin veneer of political correctness and the kind of sort of politeness that their mothers taught them to have. And were it not for the shrill voices of Rush Limbaugh and Hannity and O'Reilly and whoever these other people are who voice the resentment and the near hate for them, that it wouldn't take a whole lot if somebody gave them permission to hate. And it wouldn't necessarily be Jews because they're Jews, it's because they're different. That's what I would have said now. Journalism, being on life support in Detroit, in this era of rapid decomposition of the news and the free press, it is an honor for us to have two people who are actually practicing real journalism at real and respected journals. The New York Daily News is not generally available here, but time comes to many of our mailboxes every week, and with it a fairly comprehensive budget of foreign news or international news, thanks surely in some significant part to the skills and experience of our next speaker, now an assistant managing editor at Time, Lisa Beyer, about whom she herself says quite enough has already been said about her by our previous speaker. And so now Lisa Beyer will speak for herself on the topic of being Christian in a Jewish world, or perhaps subtitled Setting Straight My Garrulous Husband's Characterization of Our Relationship.
Thank you, Harry. I've watched Zev lecture many, many, many times, and I have never seen him lecture with notes. But I noticed last night that he noticed that I had an outline, and suddenly he was furiously writing. As Times bureau chief in Jerusalem for 9 years, I did a lot of traveling in and out of Israel. And those of you who have flown into or out of Tel Aviv know that there's a very special security procedure there, which entails talking to an official, usually young, dressed in a white shirt and blue pants, asking you lots of very personal questions. Now, if you're an Israeli and you're a Jew, as my husband can tell you, the questions are pro forma. They're like the questions at JFK or the airport here. You know, did you pack your bag? Was it with you? Have a nice flight. But if you're a foreigner, like I am, the questions are very extensive and very probing. Usually this process for me would take on average of a half hour or 45 minutes, usually involved one official speaking to me and then going off and talking to a supervisor. The supervisor would come back, ask me the same questions, they'd compare notes, and this would be quite extensive. Well, I learned early on that one of the things that the questioners had to find out is whether you were Jewish or not. It's very important to them. And with me, with my face and my name, it could go either way. Now, they know that it's rude to come right out and ask an American, are you a Jew? In Israel, that's not a rude question. People ask it all the time. So there's a series of questions meant to determine whether you're Jewish, and they go something like this. You have family in Israel? Oh? Distant relatives, maybe? Or do you speak Hebrew? A little only? Maybe some prayers? Where did you learn it? Sunday school, maybe? Well, I was always interested in getting in and out of the airport as fast as possible, so as soon as I would recognize the first of these questions, I would simply say, listen, I'm not Jewish, so that we could expedite the process, and the questioner would always say, oh, no, we are not interested in that. And we'd continue with the process. Well, the very last time I was flying out of Israel, I knew that we were leaving in the summer of 2000, and I left Israel on business to go cover the Camp David peace talks in Washington, outside of Washington. I decided I wasn't going to play it that way, just for the game of it. I wasn't going to let on whether I was or wasn't Jewish. You remember the Saturday Night Live character, Pat? Is it a man? Is it a woman? I was the ethnic Pat. So I answered every question in a way that was ambiguous, or could have gone either way. Do you have family in Israel? You know, my family, they're all dead. They asked me what my son's name was. Now, I knew from experience that if I said that my son was called Kobe, which is the Hebrew nickname for Yaakov, and is in fact what we call our son, I'd be at the gate in 5 minutes. So I said accurately that my son was named Jacob. Well, this went on and on and on. Eventually, they do run out of questions meant to determine whether you're Jewish. I mean, they can't really ask you how you feel about gefilte fish. But there were many other questions to ask. Who bought your ticket? When was it purchased? You say you're going to the Camp David peace talks. Do you have an itinerary for the Camp David peace talks? Who have you met in Israel? I'd lived there for 9 years. It was a long list. It finally became clear I was not going to make the flight. And when the hour arrived at which my plane was leaving, I leaned over to the clerk and I said, listen, I'm not Jewish. And he laughed and he said, nobody's perfect. So I come before you imperfect and a Gentile to talk to you about what it's been like to be in the Jewish world. Zev often jokes that I should write a memoir called I Walked Among Them. My Gentileness was never particularly an issue for me growing up. I wasn't really aware of it. As Zev mentioned, I grew up in South Louisiana, in the Cajun part of Louisiana, and I am half Cajun. I was raised in an extended family of Catholics, but I was raised by an atheist mother to be an atheist, and so the church we didn't go to was the Catholic Church, except when someone died or someone was married or I was in the care of my grandparents. So I knew the church, although it was not a part of me. As Zev mentioned, we can cut that out of the transcript, right? There weren't a lot of Jews in Lafayette, Louisiana, but one of them was my mother's boyfriend when I was an adolescent. So the idea of Jews and Jewishness was normal to me. I was raised by my mother not to be a bigot, and so I think basically I wasn't. I came to the world of the Jews through love. This is the love part of the section. 12 years ago, as you heard earlier, I met a man. I met him on a staircase, and if you were filming my life story, you would have the camera pan back and swivel around us to make it very clear that this was a very dramatic moment. I was then 30 years old. I'd been around, so I thought I knew what was possible in romantic love. But this relationship was beyond any others. I can't say that Zev was the man of my dreams because he was the man beyond my dreams. This was someone who knew what would amuse me before even I could feel my mouth begin to form into a smile. It was pretty intense. It was the most dramatic thing that had ever happened to me. And so, 3 years later, we were making plans for a wedding. We could not get married in Israel because, as you learned last night, there are no intermarriages in Israel. There are no secular marriages in Israel. Marriage is the purview of clerics, and clerics will only marry their kind. Jews will marry Jews, Christians will marry Christians, Muslims will marry Muslims. I wasn't particularly interested in getting married in Israel because my family isn't there, and we thought the catering would be better in America. But Zev, as an Israeli, was outraged by this, coming up against the reality of there being no way to intermarry in Israel, and he wrote an outraged column for the Jerusalem Report, which he was then writing for. We were on our honeymoon when his editor tracked us down. Now, as any of you who are aware of Zev's work knows, he is an incredibly mellifluous writer. All of his columns for the Jerusalem Report had sort of whizzed through the editing process of the Jerusalem Report up until this point. With this column, The quarrels and the quibbles never stopped. It was one editor after another calling with objections. It became very clear that the editors did not want to publish this column, and Zev thought he knew why. He thought it was because he had written unapologetically about marrying a Gentile. And when we returned to Israel, it became very clear that he was right. Our marriage was topic A, both in the pages of the magazine and among its staffers who formed a large part of our circle of friends. I felt emotionally like I had married into a family that rejected me. I was very aware intellectually of the arguments against intermarriage, but I must say that emotionally it felt a little different when it was my personal womb that was being compared to Auschwitz. We had a friend, Stuart Schaffman, who was a columnist for the magazine, I think he still is, who wrote a column that started off almost sounding like a defense, and then he eventually ended up the column by saying, while I can understand Jews and Gentiles marrying or falling in love, what they ought to do is be sure that the Gentile converts. And so ultimately I felt let down by that column that this friend of ours was saying that we had done this wrong. An elderly and very dear friend of Zev's, Michael Elkins, pulled me aside, seeing that I was distressed by this, and tried to explain to me what it meant for him to be a Jew. His analogy was this. He said that if he were standing on a beach and he saw that there were two people drowning in the sea and everything else about them was equal, but one was a Jew and one was not a Jew, he would save the Jew. Now this made a certain amount of sense to me from his point of view. On the other hand, I couldn't help but picture myself as the otherwise equal drowning Gentile. Similarly, at Passover, at the Seder, I always feel vaguely Egyptian. Another friend of ours said to me that she was very surprised to learn that I was distressed by all of this debate about our marriage because she never thought of me that way, by which she meant she never thought of me as anything but Jewish. Now, I get that a lot. I'm not a Jew, but I'm Jewish. I'm dark, I talk fast, I can argue, I'm smart. I have a friend, and every time we see him, he says to me, "Are you sure you're not Jewish?" Now, I understand that that's meant as an embrace, and it's meant as a compliment, and I've come to take it that way. But at the same time, I found that with my Jewish friends, and even with people I barely know, I often find a need to assert my differentness, to assert my Gentileness. And I will note that I'm not a Christian, by the way. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm a Gentile. Now, why do I need to tell Jews that I'm not a Jew? I hope it's not because I'm a racist. You never really know. I think that part of it has to do with self-protection. Because I pass for a Jew very easily, we have found ourselves, Zev and I, in social situations in which Jews will say things very negative or slightly negative or vaguely negative about the Goyim without understanding that I am one of them. Zev is actually much more sensitive to it than I am, I think because he basically understands the sentiment. Someone here last night said, by way of analogy, the more Judaism, the more humanity. And I felt the audience respond positively to that statement. But as a Gentile, I hear, if that's true, the less Judaism, the less humanity. What is that saying about me? I think another reason I try to tell Jews that I'm not a Jew is I don't want to find myself in the following situation. It's happened to me twice in my work that two different women, co-workers, both of them Jewish, both of them unhappy in their work, have made the assumption that I was Jewish. And whenever they've spoken to me as if we are both the victims of some kind of bias, some sort of unstated bias. One of the women has actually used the word them and they to me. Now, maybe they're talking about sexism. I've never asked them right out because it's always said in a kind of a dance. But one of the women, very early on, I set her straight, and I said, listen, I'm not Jewish, and she was very taken aback, and that was the end of that. But the other woman I never told, and this went on for years and years, and I ultimately came to feel it was too late to tell her, but I felt guilty as if I was somehow, spying for the other side. That she was telling me all of these basically kind of negative things about the Gentiles, and here I was a Gentile, and I wasn't telling her, and it was awkward. But I think more than anything else, the reason I find myself finding ways to tell Jews that I'm not a Jew is that I want to be thought of, for better or for worse, for what I am. And I don't want to be thought of, for better or for worse, for anything but what I am. I never understood that mentality until I myself became a minority living in a Jewish state. I remember once, early on in our relationship, Zev and I were visiting America, and we had to go to a dry cleaner's. And the dry cleaner told us that the shirts wouldn't be ready until Monday because Sunday was the Sabbath. And Zev responded, "It's not my Sabbath." And I thought, what do you have to say that for? Why is that important? Now I understand why he needed to say it, why he needed to assert his differentness. I found myself in Israel feeling much more Christian than I'd ever felt in America. I was once getting gasoline in East Jerusalem, and I saw these 3 gigantic Russian pilgrims who were clearly lost and who were trying to communicate in Russian to the Palestinians at the gas station. And there was only one thing they could say: Cristo, Cristo. And I understood by that they wanted to get to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So I loaded them in my car, and I took them to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There was another occasion when I was standing in line on a Friday at a grocery store in Jerusalem, and there were 3 nuns standing in front of me on the line in habits. Now, 3 nuns is a group of people that's about as far away from me. That's a group of people about whom in America I would probably feel less connected than any other group of people, but somehow, standing in this grocery store in Jerusalem, I felt I had to connect to them as co-religionists, sort of. So they were clearly Europeans of some kind, and I tried every Romance language I could possibly conjure up and just got these baffled looks. And finally, I ran out of ways to communicate until I got to the one language that we had in common, and I said, "Shabbat Shalom?" And they smiled at the little Jewish lady in the grocery store, and were very happy about it. Now, I do make one exception when it comes to clarifying my Gentileness, which is with doctors and dentists and medical specialists. Most of the doctors and dentists and medical specialists that we have, of course, are Jews, and I'm very happy for them to continue to think that I'm a Jew because I figure I'm going to get better service. Then came the children, and this is when everything got very complicated. Zev and I had talked about it was very clear we were going to have children if we could, and so we had talked in advance about how we would raise them. My own view on this is that the only thing sillier than your own religion is someone else's. So I wasn't that interested in bringing the kids up either in the church or in the synagogue. But it was extremely important to Zev, for reasons I think he's made clear, that his children at least think of themselves as Jews. And it was not important to me that my children think of themselves as non-Jews. So I said, okay, you can have this one. Now, in truth, just as Zev thought that after 9 years in Israel, I would find myself unable to leave, I thought that Zev probably wouldn't gather up the energy to actually make this happen. He's basically a lazy guy. And I said, look, if you're going to take them to Sunday school, you're going to take them. I'm not going to take them, and I'm not going to pick them up. And I thought, he'll sleep through it. He'll watch television. And it turns out he's actually going through with it. Our children attend Sunday school at a Reform synagogue near our home, as you heard. And I have some difficulty with this. It's a work in progress. The other day we were driving up country to see some friends. And it was about an hour-long drive, and about midway through it, our daughter Annie, who is 6, said, "Oh, I'm so bored." And I said to her philosophically, life is full of suffering. And she says, she's 6, she says, "Yeah, especially for the Jews." When we got to the place where we were going, which was filled with Jewish friends who know about Zev's effort to try to make our children feel Jewish, they said, "Okay, you're done. You're finished. She feels Jewish. Her education is complete. Forget about the Sunday school tuition." I appreciated the humor in the situation, but because Zev and I both burst out laughing when she said this, we then had to explain to her why we thought it was funny and that we weren't laughing at her. And it was very important for Zev to understand that, yes, she had been right, that life is especially full of suffering for the Jews. Now, I would have said more on the subject. I would have talked about the suffering of other people, which I think it's also important that Annie know about. But I didn't want to get into an argument with Zev in front of our children about the particularity or the singularity of Jewish suffering. This is his project, making the children Jewish, and I try to, for the most part, leave it to him. But we will have to have that conversation at some point. The thing that's most worrying to me about my children going off to Sunday school and thinking of themselves as Jews, which they do, is that they're going to pick up the message. It's actually beyond a fear. It's, in my heart, a certainty. They will pick up the message that Jews are better than other people, or at the very least that they're smarter than other people. Before we agreed to enroll our children in the synagogue, we went to speak to the rabbi, and I asked him about this, and he said, that's not our message here. And I asked him about the whole chosen people thing, and he said that the message that he teaches is that every people has a purpose, and that God has given a purpose to every people, and that the purpose chosen for the Jewish people is giving the Torah to the world. And I thought, well, it's kind of weak, but for the sake of peace in the family, I'll live with that. I think it's very difficult to tell any group of people that they are God's chosen people and for that group of people to simply shrug it off. I think that's a very powerful thing. Annie, our 6-year-old, came home recently and told me that she loves Jews more than other people. This was devastating to me. I don't want Annie to love that way. I don't want her to love ethnically, religiously. I want her to love who she loves because she loves who she loves. And part of it is selfish. I don't want her to love a group of people that I don't belong to. Now, I know that Annie loves me more than anybody else in the world except perhaps Zev. But still, I don't want her to love that way. Now, Zev tells me that the way Annie feels is just part of being Jewish. And maybe it is. Maybe you'll tell me. If it is, it's a part that I could do without, personally. There are other parts of Jewishness, though, that I have to admit I have taken on. For example, like Jews, I have to know who's Jewish. I gotta know. Which reminds me, Derek? Jew, not Jew?
Me?
You.
You asked last night.
What did you say?
You asked me if I was Jewish.
And you said you're Jewish.
I said absolutely.
Zev, you owe me $5. Now, I don't go all the way with this. Okay, I'm not completely Jewish about this. For example, if you say Wes Clark to me, I think NATO commander, presidential candidate, attractive guy on CNN. I do not think Jew. Half Jew, born Jew, you know, father a Jew. On my father's side, I come from Germans. I come from a very sweet group of peasants who immigrated to this country 100 years ago. I spent a lot of time with them when I was a child. My grandmother sang lullabies to me in German, so it was a language of love to me. We used to have these very sumptuous family reunions where all these marvelous potato salads and various strudels were served. And so the first time that I went to Germany as a backpacking college student, I went to Heidelberg as part of a European tour. I experienced Germany as a homecoming. It was very familiar to me and to all of my senses. And I honestly can't remember thinking about the Holocaust even once. It didn't enter my mind. The second and only other time that I went to Germany was on business. I went to Berlin after living in Israel for 9 years, and it was a completely different country for me. I saw Nazis everywhere. Another way in which I've become Jewish, well, let me put it this way. I have become so Jewish that I was arrested in the Jewish state for excessive chutzpah. Honest. I was leaving the airport at Tel Aviv. I was at immigration, And I put my passport, up, gave it to the official, and I said, shalom, although nobody does that in Israel. Nobody says hello, but I'm from the South, so I said, shalom. And as she was checking through my passport, which has a lot of, stamps from Arab countries because I travel a lot, so it was a lengthy process, I went back to reading my magazine article, and I was just standing there like this, reading the magazine article, making sure she could see my face, but reading. And after a while, she said, Slicha? Excuse me? And I said, yes, and I just looked at her, and she said nothing, so she went back to her work. I went back to my magazine article, and after a moment, again, she said, Slicha? And I looked up, and she said, do you think it's appropriate to be reading a magazine while I'm checking you? Now, the woman that my mama raised would have said, oh, I'm sorry. Gee, gosh, I didn't mean to offend you. I'm so terribly sorry. And I would have put the magazine article away. But I had been in Israel for 9 years. I could give as well as I could get. So I thought about it for a moment, and I said, yes, I think it's appropriate. I'm showing you my face. I don't see what the problem is. And she came out from her booth, and she arrested me. She brought me to the police station, and she explained to the supervisor there that this one had the chutzpah to read a magazine while she was checking my passport. And I said, am I under arrest for chutzpah? And she said, yes. And she left, and the supervisor kept me there for about 15 minutes. That was my sentence. And then he sent me on my way. Now, as my husband will attest, I do not always appreciate chutzpah in other people. But I have found, for me, it's pretty useful. The last way in which I've sort of become Jewish, and this will be my final comment, is that I found myself in the context of our large family, which as I've explained, as almost an explainer of Judaism, at least to our nanny Felsi, the Catholic from Goa, who Zev mentioned. I came home from work one day in Jerusalem, and Zev said to me, come on, Felsi, ask her, ask Lisa. You said you were going to ask her. And Felsi said, all right, Lisa, was Jesus a Jew? Now, Zev had told her that Jesus was a Jew, and she was very upset by this. But Zev has no credibility with the housekeeper whatsoever. She doesn't believe anything he says. Her comment whenever he tells her something is, Lisa will say. So I said, listen, Felsi, I know it's shocking to you, but yes, Jesus was a Jew. Well, coming from me, she had to entertain the possibility, so she thought about it for a minute, and she said, Jesus was not Christian? And I said, no, think about it. Jesus Christ, Christian. The Christians came after Christ. And she said, Mary was not a Christian? I said, no, Felsi, at the time of Mary, there were no Christians. She thought about that, and she said, maybe not here.